The handcuffs clicked shut around Grace Callahan's wrists before she even understood what was happening. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for criminal trespassing," Deputy Brett Coleman said, gripping her arm. Grace stared at him, dust still clinging to her boots from checking the fence line an hour earlier. "Trespassing? Brett, I've walked this land since I was 6 years old. This is my ranch." "Not according to the new survey filed with the county," Coleman said, not quite meeting her eyes. "This section belongs to Dalton Energy now." Behind him, a black pickup truck idled on the gravel road. Tinted windows rolled halfway down. A man in a pressed shirt and sunglasses watched from the driver's seat, sipping coffee like he was watching a mildly interesting movie. "That's my grandfather's land," Grace said, her voice rising. "That's 4 generations of Callahans." "Take it up with the judge," Coleman said, guiding her toward the patrol car. Neighbors had gathered along the fence line, phones already out, recording. An older rancher named Walter Higgins shook his head. "This isn't right, Brett. You know this isn't right." Coleman didn't answer. He opened the patrol car door and put a hand on Grace's head, easing her into the back seat like she was some kind of criminal, not a 58-year-old widow who'd spent her entire life on this soil. As the door shut, Grace caught one final look at the man in the truck. He raised his coffee cup toward her, almost like a toast. She had no idea, sitting in the back of that patrol car, that within 2 weeks, the same county that had just arrested her for trespassing on her own land would be forced to admit something far bigger. Something that would change everything. Not just for Grace Callahan, but for half the state of Wyoming. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. I read as many as I can, and it means a lot to see this story reach so many places. If you enjoy powerful justice stories with unforgettable twists like this one, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us bring you more stories like this. Now, let's go back to Grace and find out exactly what she was about to uncover. Grace Callahan had lived her entire life on Callahan Ridge Ranch, 12,000 acres of grazing, land tucked against the foothills outside. The small town of Larkspur, Wyoming. Her grandfather, Thomas Callahan, had homesteaded the land back in 1911, back when the government still handed out deeds to anyone willing to work the ground and survive. Its brutal winters. Grace's father had expanded the ranch. Grace herself had run it for the last 20 years, ever since her husband, Daniel, had passed from a sudden stroke while repairing a windmill pump on the north pasture. She raised cattle. She fixed her own fences. She drove the same rusted Ford truck she'd owned since 1998, patched together with baling wire and stubbornness. In town, people knew her as tough but fair, the kind of woman who'd drive 40 miles in a snowstorm to help a neighbor pull a calf, but who'd also stare down a bank manager without blinking if she thought he was overcharging her on interest. She had one daughter, Emily Callahan, a nurse living 2 hours away in Casper, who worried constantly about her mother living alone on such a large piece of land. "Mom, you're 58, Emily told her often. "You don't have to do all of this by yourself." "This ranch is in my bones, Em," Grace always replied. "It's not something I do. It's who I am." Grace's daily life followed a rhythm as old as the land itself. Up before sunrise, coffee on the stove, cattle to check, fences to mend, and always, the low hum of worry about water. In dry country like Larkspur, water wasn't just useful, it was everything. And Grace held something most people in town didn't fully understand. Her family's original homestead claim included water rights running along Cutter Creek, rights that had been quietly recognized in old territorial records for over a century. She rarely thought about those old papers. They sat in a metal lockbox in her closet, alongside her husband's old pocket watch and her grandfather's original homestead deed. She had no idea how much those papers were about to matter. 2 days before her arrest, A strange survey crew had shown up on the eastern edge of her property, hammering stakes into the ground without permission. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Grace had asked, walking up with her hands on her hips. One of the men glanced at a clipboard. "Ma'am, we're marking the new Dalton Energy boundary line." Grace felt something cold settle in her stomach. "There is no Dalton Energy boundary line," she said. "Not on my land." Marcus Dalton had never once dug a fence post, branded a calf, or worked a single day of physical labor in his life. And he was proud of that fact. As CEO of Dalton Energy, a mid-sized oil and gas company expanding aggressively across southern Wyoming, Marcus had built his fortune buying up mineral rights, leasing land for pipelines, and, when negotiations grew difficult, finding creative solutions to boundary disputes. He'd set his sights on a new pipeline corridor running straight through Larkspur County, connecting a recently discovered natural gas field to a processing plant near the interstate. The most efficient route ran directly through 12,000 acres of prime, easily accessible land. Grace Callahan's land. Marcus had made her a fair offer in his mind, a modest lease payment in exchange for pipeline access through her eastern pastures. Grace had refused, calmly but firmly, in a 15-minute meeting at her kitchen table. "I'm not selling access to a pipeline that'll poison Cutter Creek if it ever ruptures," Grace had told him. "Not for any amount of money." Marcus had smiled thinly, shaken her hand, and left. Then he'd gone straight to Sheriff Dale Pruitt's office, a man who owed his re-election campaign, quite literally, to a generous community support fund that Dalton Energy had contributed to the year before. "She's an obstacle," Marcus told the sheriff over drinks at the Larkspur Grill. "A stubborn old woman sitting on land my company needs. Surely there's a way to encourage her to reconsider." Sheriff Pruitt had nodded slowly, already understanding the unspoken request beneath the polite words. Within a week, a quiet amendment appeared in the county survey records, shifting the boundary line of Callahan Ridge Ranch nearly 400 acres westward, conveniently placing Grace's own home pasture on what now appeared, on paper, to be Dalton Energy property. Deputy Brett Coleman, young and eager to prove himself to a sheriff he admired more than he should have, was assigned to handle the situation the moment Grace was caught walking her own fence line. Marcus Dalton watched from his truck that morning with quiet satisfaction, sipping his coffee as Grace was placed in handcuffs. He had no idea that Grace Callahan's family history ran far deeper and far more powerfully through the state of Wyoming than his lawyers had ever bothered to research. The Larkspur County booking station smelled like old coffee and cleaning solution. Grace sat in a plastic chair, wrists finally free of the handcuffs, staring at the deputy processing her paperwork. "This is a mistake," she said quietly. "You know this land is mine, Brett. Your mother used to buy eggs from me." Coleman didn't look up from his clipboard. "The survey says otherwise, Mrs. Callahan." Word spread through Larkspur faster than any wildfire. By that afternoon, half the town had heard some version of the story. Grace Callahan, arrested for trespassing on her own family ranch. Some neighbors rallied to her side immediately. Walter Higgins showed up at the sheriff's office demanding answers. "That woman has run cattle on that ridge longer than most of us have been alive," he told anyone who'd listen. "Something's not right about this." But others, especially those who'd taken quiet lease payments from Dalton Energy on their own land, whispered a different story. That Grace was being stubborn, difficult, standing in the way of jobs and progress the pipeline promised to bring. Grace's daughter, Emily, drove 2 hours from Casper the moment she heard, arriving at the station pale and furious. "You arrested my mother for walking on her own property?" Emily said to the officer at the front desk. "According to the updated county survey, that section is now designated Dalton Energy Land," the officer said flatly. "Updated survey?" Emily repeated. "Updated when?" Nobody had a clear answer. Grace was released that evening on her own recognizance, given a court date 3 weeks out, and handed a printed copy of the new boundary survey. A document that, upon closer inspection, bore a filing date of just 4 days earlier. That night, sitting at her kitchen table with the survey spread out before her, Grace felt something shift inside her. Not fear. Something closer to quiet, focused resolve. "They think I'll just roll over," she murmured to Emily, who sat beside her exhausted from the drive. "Mom, maybe it's not worth fighting a whole energy company," Emily said carefully. "What if they hurt you next time? What if—" "Emily," Grace interrupted gently, "your great-grandfather rode out here with nothing but a wagon and a shovel. If I let a man like Marcus Dalton steamroll over what he built, I don't deserve to carry the name Callahan." She reached into the hallway closet and pulled down the old metal lockbox she hadn't opened in nearly 10 years. Inside sat a collection of yellowed papers she hadn't looked at closely since her grandfather's funeral. Deeds, letters, and one thick folder marked simply, "Water Rights, Cutter Creek Basin, 1911 present." She had absolutely no idea what she was about to find inside it. The court date arrived faster than Grace expected. She hired the only lawyer in Larkspur County who agreed to take the case. A young, overworked attorney named Rebecca Wilson, fresh out of law school and running her own small practice out of a converted storefront on Main Street. "I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Callahan," Rebecca said during their first meeting. "Dalton Energy has resources most attorneys in this county can't match. This won't be easy." "I don't need easy," Grace said. "I need the truth to come out." The preliminary hearing did not go well. Dalton Energy's legal team arrived with 3 attorneys in expensive suits, presenting the newly filed survey as clean, professional, and unquestionable. The county clerk, visibly uncomfortable, confirmed the survey had indeed been filed and recorded properly under current procedure. "Your Honor," Rebecca argued, "this survey directly contradicts the original 1911 homestead deed, which has never been amended, challenged, or disputed in over a century." The judge, a cautious man named Harold Denning up for re-election that fall, studied both documents for a long moment. "I'm inclined to allow the new survey to stand pending further review," Judge Denning said finally. "The county recorder's office has already certified it." Grace felt the room tilt slightly beneath her. A century of family history, dismissed with a single sentence. Outside the courthouse, Marcus Dalton offered Grace a thin, practiced smile. "I do hope we can resolve this like reasonable people, Mrs. Callahan. My offer for the pipeline lease still stands." Grace didn't respond. She simply walked past him toward her truck. That evening, an unexpected visitor arrived at Callahan Ridge Ranch. An older man named Frank Delgado, who introduced himself as a retired county records clerk who'd worked in the Larkspur recorder's office for over 30 years before retiring the previous spring. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, standing nervously on her porch, "I heard about your case. I think you should know something about how that survey got filed." Grace invited him inside immediately. The current recorder, Diane Ashford, took over the office about 8 months ago, Frank explained, sitting stiffly at Grace's kitchen table. Before that, boundary changes required a 2-week public notice period and a physical inspection. "I noticed the notice period for your property. It doesn't appear to have happened at all." Grace felt her pulse quicken. "Can you prove that?" Frank hesitated. "I might still have access to some of the old filing logs, but if Dalton Energy finds out I talked to you, I could lose my pension." Grace studied the frightened but determined man across her table. "Frank," she said quietly, "how far are you willing to go to make this right?" Frank didn't answer right away. He just stared down at his hands, clearly wrestling with a decision that could change both of their lives. 3 days later, Grace received a call from Rebecca Wilson that made her sit down at her kitchen table before she even finished dialing back. "Grace, I need you to come to my office," Rebecca said. "Frank Delgado brought something in this morning. I think you need to see this in person." When Grace arrived, Rebecca slid a thin manila folder across her desk. Inside was a photocopied filing log page, dated from 8 months earlier, showing a list of properties flagged for expedited boundary review, a designation Frank explained had never existed in the county's filing system before Diane Ashford took office. Callahan Ridge Ranch appeared third on the list. "There are 11 other properties on here," Rebecca said, "all bordering the proposed pipeline corridor." Grace stared at the list, her mind racing. "This isn't just about me." "No," Rebecca said grimly. "It looks like a pattern." But something else on the page caught Grace's eye. A small handwritten note in the margin, initialed simply DA, referencing something called Case W 1911 Basin, alongside her property's parcel number. "What's that supposed to mean?" Grace asked. Rebecca frowned, flipping through her own notes. "I don't know yet. But it's referencing a filing number I've never seen before. It doesn't match the standard county numbering system at all." That evening, Grace called Emily, unable to shake a strange, nagging feeling. "There's something in these old family papers I haven't looked at yet," she said. "Something about water rights. I think I need to go through everything, all the way back to your great-great-grandfather's original filings." "Mom, it's almost midnight," Emily said, though she could hear the determination in her mother's voice. "I know," Grace said, "but I don't think I'm going to sleep until I understand what that note means." She sat at her kitchen table until nearly 3 in the morning, working through faded, brittle documents from 1911, 1922, and 1947. Territorial water rights filings, early state basin agreements, records of agreements between her grandfather and half a dozen neighboring ranch families. Somewhere in that towering, dusty stack of paper sat an answer that would soon make Marcus Dalton's entire pipeline plan collapse. But Grace didn't know it yet. She had only found the first thread of something much, much larger. The following week brought a fresh blow. A formal letter arrived from the Larkspur County Water Board, informing Grace that her ranch's irrigation permit was under administrative review, pending resolution of the boundary dispute, effectively cutting off her legal ability to draw water from Cutter Creek for her cattle. "They're trying to starve me out," Grace told Rebecca over the phone, her voice tight with controlled anger. Worse news followed. At a town hall meeting organized to discuss the Dalton Energy Pipeline project, Sheriff Pruitt stood before a crowd of nearly 200 residents and characterized Grace's case as an unfortunate but necessary legal matter, implying she had knowingly interfered with a certified survey. Several neighbors who had accepted Dalton Energy lease payments nodded along, visibly relieved to have their own arrangements framed as reasonable and cooperative by comparison. Grace stood near the back of the room, watching her own community slowly turn a legitimate boundary theft into a story about one difficult, uncooperative rancher. Then came the betrayal that hurt worse than anything Marcus Dalton had done. Walter Higgins, the neighbor who'd shown up at the sheriff's station the day of her arrest, approached her outside the town hall, looking uncomfortable. "Grace," he said quietly, "I signed a lease with Dalton last week. For the North 40 acres. I couldn't turn down that kind of money. Not with my daughter's medical bills." Grace felt something in her chest tighten, though she kept her voice steady. "I understand, Walter. I really do." But standing there, watching the one ally she thought she could count on quietly change sides, Grace felt more alone than she had since Daniel's funeral. That night, Frank Delgado called her, his voice barely above a whisper. "Grace, I found something else," he said. "That case number, W 1911 Basin. I finally figured out what it references. It's not a modern filing at all." "What is it?" Grace asked. "It's a territorial-era water rights compact," Frank said. "One that predates Wyoming statehood itself. And, Grace, your grandfather's name is on it, not as a participant." Frank paused, and Grace could hear him take a steadying breath before continuing. As the original signing trustee, Grace gripped the phone tightly. "Trustee of what, Frank?" The line went quiet for a long moment. "I think you need to sit down for this conversation," Frank said, "because I don't think either of us fully understands what that means yet." Grace hung up the phone that night and sat alone in her kitchen for a long time, staring at her grandfather's photograph on the wall. A stern, weathered man standing beside a covered wagon, squinting into a 1901 sun. She thought about the stories her grandfather used to tell her as a little girl, sitting on the porch after supper. Stories about the brutal first winter on the ranch, when half the cattle died and neighboring families nearly starved. Stories about how the ranchers of the Cutter Creek Basin had banded together, pooling resources, sharing water during the driest years, forming agreements that outlasted droughts, wars, and generations. "Land means nothing without water, Gracie," her grandfather used to tell her. "Remember that. Whoever controls the water controls everything." At the time, she'd thought it was simply an old rancher's wisdom, the kind of saying passed down without much practical weight behind it. She thought of her husband, Daniel, and how hard they'd worked together to keep the ranch running after her father passed. The droughts they'd survived, the debts they'd paid off one stubborn year at a time, the quiet promise they'd made to each other that Callahan Ridge would still be standing when Emily's own children were old enough to run cattle across it. She thought of Daniel's funeral, and how half the county had shown up, not because they owed the Callahans anything, but because Daniel had spent 30 years helping neighbors when their wells ran dry, or their tractors broke down during calving season. "We built something bigger than ourselves out here," Grace whispered to the empty kitchen. "Didn't we, Daniel?" She reached for the old lockbox one more time, pulling out a faded photograph she hadn't looked at in years. Her grandfather standing with 5 other ranchers along the banks of Cutter Creek, all of them smiling, holding a single rolled document between them. On the back, in her grandfather's careful handwriting, were 7 words that suddenly meant more than she could have imagined. "The day we made sure everyone survives." Grace pressed the photograph to her chest and allowed herself, finally, to cry. Not from fear and not from anger, but from the overwhelming realization that her grandfather had left her something far more important than a ranch. He had left her a responsibility to an entire community, and she was only just beginning to understand its true size. 2 days later, Frank Delgado arrived at Callahan Ridge Ranch with a thick folder of copied records, along with a retired water law attorney he'd once worked alongside, named Dennis Fairweather. "Mrs. Callahan," Dennis said, spreading documents across her kitchen table, "what your grandfather signed in 1911 wasn't a simple neighborly agreement. It was a formal territorial water compact, later grandfathered into Wyoming state water law when statehood was formalized." "I don't understand what that means in practice," Grace admitted. Dennis pulled out a hand-drawn basin map, considerably larger than she expected. "This compact established your grandfather, and by inheritance, you, as the senior water rights trustee for the entire Cutter Creek Basin, an area spanning parts of 4 counties. Grace stared at the map, her mind struggling to process the scope of it. "Every ranch that draws water from this basin," Dennis continued, tracing lines across the paper, "including several towns, agricultural cooperatives, and even a portion of the interstate highway rest area system, operates under water allocations that ultimately trace back through your family's original trustee agreement." "That can't be right," Grace said. "I've never made a single decision about anyone else's water." "Because your father and grandfather quietly delegated day-to-day water board decisions to the county for decades," Dennis explained, "but they never formally dissolved the original trust, which means, legally, the senior authority still rests with you." Frank leaned forward. "Grace, this is why that boundary survey matters so much to Dalton Energy. If they can discredit you, arrest you, paint you as an unreliable landowner disputing basic property lines, they weaken any future water rights claim you might assert against their pipeline route, which, according to Dennis's research, crosses protected basin land that legally requires trustee approval. Grace sat back in her chair, stunned. They didn't just want my land. They needed me to look unreliable so I couldn't stop the pipeline through the water basin. Exactly, Dennis said. And there's one more thing you should know. He pulled out a final document, a formal state registry list from the Wyoming Department of Water Resources. This compact doesn't just cover Larkspur County, he said quietly. Similar trustee agreements, all linked through the original 1911 filing, extend across 3 additional basins your grandfather helped establish during the early statehood water conventions. Grace looked up at him, her breath caught in her throat. Mrs. Callahan, Dennis said gently, depending on how the state chooses to formally recognize these original trustee rights, you may hold senior water authority over water systems supporting close to half of Wyoming's agricultural land. The kitchen went completely silent. Grace thought of Marcus Dalton's thin, confident smile outside the courthouse. He had no idea what he'd actually started. The rescheduled hearing took place 3 weeks later, and this time the courtroom was standing room only. Word had spread throughout the county. Something bigger than a simple boundary dispute was happening, though few people understood exactly what. Marcus Dalton arrived with his usual confidence, flanked by his legal team. Sheriff Pruitt sat near the front row. Deputy Coleman stood quietly near the back wall, looking increasingly uncertain about the case he'd been ordered to enforce. Rebecca Wilson stood before Judge Denning, Dennis Fairweather seated beside her as an expert witness. Your Honor, Rebecca began, today we're not simply here to dispute a boundary survey. We're here to correct the court's understanding of exactly whose authority governs this land and the water beneath it. Dennis Fairweather took the stand, methodically walking the courtroom through the 1911 Territorial Compact, the Statehood Grandfather Clause, and the unbroken chain of trusteeship passed down through 3 generations of the Callahan family. Marcus Dalton's confident expression began to falter as Dennis continued. In simple terms, Your Honor, Dennis said, Dalton Energy's proposed pipeline route crosses protected basin land requiring formal trustee approval. Approval that was never sought and would never have been granted, given the environmental risk to Cutter Creek. Rebecca then presented Frank Delgado's filing logs, demonstrating that the expedited boundary review process used to alter Grace's property line had bypassed required public notice procedures for 11 different properties, all conveniently located along the pipeline's proposed corridor. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Furthermore, Rebecca continued, Recorder Diane Ashford's expedited review process began just 2 months after receiving a substantial private consulting payment from Dalton Energy, records of which our office obtained through a formal state ethics complaint filed last week. Marcus Dalton shot up from his seat. Objection, Your Honor. This is completely irrelevant to— Sit down, Mr. Dalton, Judge Denning said sharply, his earlier caution replaced by visible frustration. You'll have your turn to respond. Rebecca turned to face the packed courtroom. The truth, Your Honor, is simple. Grace Callahan was never trespassing on anyone's land. She was walking across property her family has legally owned for over a century. Property tied to water rights authority, spanning nearly half this state's agricultural water systems. Every head in the courtroom turned toward Grace, sitting quietly beside her attorney, hands folded in her lap. Marcus Dalton stared at her, his confident expression completely gone, replaced by something closer to dawning, horrified realization. He had spent months trying to discredit a woman he assumed was simply a stubborn rancher standing in his way. He had never once imagined she held quiet legal authority over water resources that half the ranchers, farmers, and small towns across Wyoming's agricultural backbone ultimately depended upon. Judge Denning called for a brief recess before delivering his ruling, giving the courtroom time to fully absorb what had just been revealed. When proceedings resumed, the room was completely silent. "This court finds," Judge Denning said, "that the boundary survey filed against Callahan Ridge Ranch was conducted in direct violation of standard county notification procedure and is hereby nullified in its entirety. The original 1911 homestead boundary stands as legally recognized." Applause broke out before the judge raised his hand for silence. "Furthermore," he continued, "given clear evidence of ethics violations connected to expedited survey filings benefiting Dalton Energy's pipeline interests, this court is formally referring County Recorder Diane Ashford, Sheriff Dale Pruitt, and Dalton Energy's corporate leadership to the Wyoming Attorney General's office for full investigation." Marcus Dalton sat frozen, his attorneys whispering urgently beside him. "As for the criminal trespassing charge against Mrs. Grace Callahan," Judge Denning said, turning to look directly at her, "this court finds absolutely no basis for that charge. It is dismissed, effective immediately. And I would like to personally apologize for the distress this office's error caused you." Grace nodded, her eyes glistening, but her voice remained steady when she stood to speak. "Your Honor," she said, "I don't need an apology. I need the water in Cutter Creek to stay clean for the next 100 years, the way my grandfather intended when he signed that compact." Judge Denning nodded solemnly. "The court formally recognizes the continued validity of the 1911 Water Trustee Compact. Any future development affecting the Cutter Creek Basin will require your formal review and approval, as outlined in the original agreement." Outside the courthouse, reporters from as far as Cheyenne had gathered, having caught wind of a story far bigger than a simple property dispute. Cameras flashed as Grace walked down the courthouse steps, Emily at her side, Rebecca and Frank close behind. Sheriff Pruitt resigned from his position within the week, facing mounting pressure from the state investigation. Deputy Coleman, who cooperated fully with investigators once the full picture became clear, kept his job and later personally apologized to Grace at a community gathering. Marcus Dalton's pipeline project was suspended indefinitely pending a full environmental and ethics review. Dalton Energy's board of directors, facing significant public backlash and a plummeting stock price, quietly removed him from his position as CEO less than 2 months later. Walter Higgins, ashamed of his earlier lease agreement, showed up at Grace's ranch the following week, offering to help repair the fence line Dalton's survey crew had originally damaged. "I should have stood by you from the start," he said. Grace shook his hand. "You're standing here now, Walter. That's what matters." For the first time in weeks, Grace Callahan felt the quiet, solid ground of Callahan Ridge Ranch firmly beneath her feet again. Not just as her home, but as the responsibility her grandfather had entrusted to her all along. 1 month later, the town of Larkspur held a community gathering at the Old Grange Hall, organized by ranchers throughout the Cutter Creek Basin who wanted to formally thank Grace for protecting water rights that, they now understood, had quietly supported their families for generations without most of them ever realizing it. Frank Delgado stood near the back of the hall, finally at peace, having risked his pension to help uncover the truth. The county, in recognition of his role, later reinstated his full retirement benefits and issued a formal commendation for his decades of honest service. Rebecca Wilson's small law practice saw a wave of new clients throughout the following months, ranchers and small landowners who finally felt they had someone in Larkspur County willing to stand up against powerful interests. Emily sat beside her mother during the gathering, watching neighbor after neighbor approach to shake Grace's hand. "I used to worry you were doing all of this alone out here," Emily said quietly. "I didn't realize how many people you were actually taking care of, all along." Grace smiled, looking around the room at faces she'd known her entire life. "Neither did I, honestly. Not until all of this happened. Walter Higgins stood to speak near the end of the evening, addressing the room. Grace Callahan didn't just save her own ranch, he said. She saved water rights that half of us didn't even know we depended on. I think we owe her more than a thank you. I think we owe her the kind of support she's given all of us over the years, whenever we needed it. The room erupted into warm applause. That night, driving home under a wide Wyoming sky filled with stars, Grace glanced over at Emily in the passenger seat. Your great-grandfather always said land means nothing without water, Grace said. I finally understand what he meant. Emily smiled. What's that? It's never really about what you own, Grace said. It's about what you protect, and who you protect it for. As they pulled up to the old ranch house, its porch light glowing warmly against the darkening hills, Grace felt something settle deep inside her chest. Not just relief, but a quiet, unshakable sense of purpose that would carry Callahan Ridge Ranch and the community around it into whatever came next. So, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. I read every single one I can. And tell me, what was your favorite moment in Grace's story? Was it the moment she opened that old lockbox? Or the moment the courtroom realized exactly who they'd been dealing with all along? Would you have fought as hard as Grace did, even when your own neighbors turned against you? If this story moved you, do me a favor. Hit that like button, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep bringing you powerful, unforgettable stories, just like this one. See you in the next story.